Little homeless girl holds her baby brother in her arms and pleads with a trucker, "Please take him." The trucker, stunned, does the unthinkable. Jason was a man with easy conversation, someone who always had a story to tell and a comment ready for any situation. Friendly and good-humored, he enjoyed making small talk at gas stations, cracking jokes with other truck drivers, and asking about the lives of the people he crossed paths with. Even with the loneliness inherent to his profession, he never truly felt alone, because he carried with him the habit of turning brief encounters into moments of connection. His calm smile and serene voice conveyed trust, and he knew how to listen as much as he knew how to speak, always respecting each person's time and space. Despite spending long periods on the road, Jason had never distanced himself from his family. Laura, his wife, was his safe harbor, the woman who understood his absences and greeted him with warmth whenever he returned home. Their marriage was strong, built on mutual understanding and respect. Even from a distance, he made a point to call every day, asking how they were, listening to the news, and making sure that Karen, his daughter, knew that her father was thinking of her with every mile he drove. When he was home, he dedicated himself entirely to them, compensating for the distance with real presence, helping with chores, playing with his daughter, and enjoying every moment with them. He never complained about the exhaustion, believing that family always came first. That night, the dark road stretched out in front of Jason as it always did, but something different broke the monotony. He spotted a figure on the roadside, a small silhouette under the dim light of a solitary street lamp. The sight made his chest tighten immediately. He instinctively slowed down, frowning as he tried to understand what he was seeing. His headlights illuminated the scene more clearly, and what he saw made his heart weigh down like never before. There, standing in the biting cold of the night, was a frail girl, dressed in rags so worn they barely covered her skinny body. In her arms, she held a small bundle, a baby wrapped in a fabric too thin to protect him from the cold night. The girl's tangled hair partially covered her face, but he could see the large, pleading eyes staring at him. It was a look that didn't belong to an ordinary child. It was a look marked by hunger, desperation, and fear. She raised one of her hands, trembling, making an uncertain gesture asking for help. The fragile, almost hesitant movement suggested she might have tried before, unsuccessfully. Jason felt something stir inside him. His instinct as a roadman told him that situations like this were never simple, but his heart told him he couldn't just drive past. With a heavy sigh, he pulled the truck to the shoulder and stopped. The girl hesitated for a moment before moving. With uncertain steps, she approached the cabin, each movement of hers carrying a weight that seemed far greater than her small body should bear. Jason, still unsure of what to do, unlocked the door and opened it. He barely had time to react before she raised her arms. "Please take him," she said, her voice small but full of urgency. Jason frowned, his heart racing. "Take him? Why?" he asked, his voice coming out firmer than he intended. The girl lowered her head slightly, pressing the baby closer to herself before answering, almost in a whisper. "He needs someone to take care of him, someone who can give him food, a warm place. If he stays with me, he will die." Jason froze. What should he do? His gaze went from the girl's dirty and anguished face to the baby in her arms. The child was motionless, too silent. The weight of those words hit him like a punch to the chest. She wasn't asking because she wanted to, but because she believed it was the only chance the child had to survive. The desperation of that decision was too great for someone so young. He looked around, searching for an adult, someone who might be responsible for these children, but there was no one. Just her, the baby, and the silent darkness of the road. His first impulse was to take the baby, to ensure at least he would be safe. But how could he just take the child and keep driving, leaving the girl behind? The thought was unthinkable. "How long have you been here?" he asked, getting out of the cab and crouching in front of her. The girl bit her lower lip, hesitant. "Since before dark," she replied. No one stopped. The revelation hit him like a punch. How many drivers had passed without even slowing down? How many people had seen those children and simply ignored them? Jason looked at her again. Her thinness was alarming. The baby, so small and fragile, barely reacted. The girl was shaking from the cold, her feet bare and dirty. He swallowed hard. "What's your name?" he asked. "Stephanie," she replied, her voice filled with distrust. Jason took a deep breath. Then he did the unthinkable. "I'm not taking just the baby," he said, extending his hand to her. "You both are coming with me." Stephanie's eyes widened, surprised. For a moment it seemed like she wanted to refuse. Her small hand trembled before finally gripping his. Her hold was firm, as if by grabbing his calloused fingers, she was holding on to the only hope left. Without another word, Jason helped her into the cab. He closed the door carefully and returned to the wheel, feeling a new weight on his shoulders. It wasn't just the weight of two fragile, defenseless children. It was the weight of a responsibility he had never imagined carrying. After they left, the silence in the cab was tense. Stephanie held the baby tightly to her chest, her eyes watching his every movement. Jason held the wheel firmly, but knew he had to break that barrier. "Who's the baby?" Jason asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. The girl pressed the small body closer to herself, as if afraid he would disappear from her arms. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice low and laden with exhaustion. "My brother." Jason blinked, feeling the impact of those words. Then he softened his tone. "What's his name?" The girl took a few seconds before answering, not taking her eyes off her brother. "Patrick." "Is he awake?" Stephanie nodded, but didn't seem convinced. He doesn't cry much, almost never." That wasn't good. Jason knew healthy babies cried. "Has he eaten anything today?" "I gave him some bread," she replied, almost ashamed. Jason bit his lip, holding back a curse. "We'll stop at the next gas station," he said. "We'll get food for you both." Stephanie looked at him as if she didn't know if she could believe him, but she didn't say anything. Jason drove for a few more minutes in silence, his thoughts heavy. The girl beside him was tense, holding the baby tightly, as if she still wasn't sure he wouldn't abandon them. The trucker felt the weight of responsibility growing with each passing kilometer. They needed food, warmth, and some safety. He spotted a gas station ahead, one of those that stayed open during the night. Jason slowed down and maneuvered the truck into the parking lot. "Let's get something to eat," he said, looking at the girl. Stephanie stared at him with distrust, but didn't protest. She just adjusted Patrick in her arms and waited as he opened the door to help her down. The cold wind of the night hit her skin the moment her feet touched the ground, and she instinctively wrapped the baby in her own body, trying to warm him up. Jason held the convenience store door open for her to enter first. The warmth inside was immediate, causing Stephanie to blink a few times, as if she wasn't used to places like that. He grabbed a basket and started walking down the aisles, picking up bread, milk, cookies, some fruits, and a pack of diapers. "You can grab whatever you want," he said, glancing at her. She hesitated. Her eyes scanned the shelves, but she didn't move. It was clear she wasn't used to just picking something out without having to beg. "Go ahead. Grab something for yourself," he insisted. She looked at him, then back at the shelves, biting her lip. Hesitantly, she grabbed a small package of cookies and a box of juice. She held them as if they were something precious, not daring to ask for more. Jason sighed and added more food to the basket before heading to the checkout. He paid for everything without saying a word, ignoring the cashier's curious look. With the bags in hand, he guided Stephanie back to the truck, where they could eat more peacefully. Once inside the cab, Jason handed the juice and cookies to her. "Eat slowly," he said, "and see if Patrick can drink some of the milk." Stephanie nodded, opening the juice box with trembling fingers. She took a sip and, without thinking, grabbed a cookie, devouring it quickly. When she realized what she had done, she looked at Jason as if expecting a scolding. "You can eat. There's more," he said with a half smile. She lowered her eyes, embarrassed, but continued eating. While chewing, she grabbed the small bottle of milk Jason had bought and carefully tried to give some to the baby. He hesitated, but accepted small amounts. The trucker watched the scene for a moment before deciding it was time to ask, "Stephanie, where are your parents?" The girl froze for a moment, then lowered her head, her shoulders tense. "I don't know," she murmured. "They disappeared." Jason didn't respond immediately, just waited. "It was a while ago," she continued, her voice low. "I don't know if they ran away or if they died." She didn't need to say anything else. The helplessness in her voice explained everything. "And since then, you've been alone?" Stephanie nodded, breaking another cookie in small pieces to feed to the baby, even though he couldn't chew properly. "I tried to take care of Patrick. I really tried," she said, her voice cracking a little. "But it's hard." Jason looked at her, then at the baby in her arms. He felt a lump form in his throat. "I know you tried, Stephanie," he said sincerely. She lowered her eyes, hugging her brother tighter. "I just wanted him to have a chance." Jason ran a hand over his face, breathing deeply. "Now he does," he said. "You both do." The girl didn't answer, but for the first time, her eyes didn't carry only fear. There was a small spark of hope in them. Jason knew that, whatever happened, he wouldn't leave them behind. After they finished eating, they returned to the truck, and Jason started the engine again. The road stretched out before them, illuminated only by the headlights, while the silence inside the cab was no longer as heavy as before. Stephanie held Patrick carefully, but her shoulders were no longer as stiff, and her gaze no longer avoided Jason's. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, the slight movement of the truck rocking him to sleep. Jason drove without haste, focused on the road, but also on the presence of the two children by his side. What had started as an unexpected night now felt like an irreversible path, a decision that, though unplanned, he knew he couldn't undo. The trucker let out a quiet sigh. "We're almost there," he said, without taking his eyes off the road. Stephanie didn't respond immediately. She just nodded, almost imperceptibly. Jason knew she was scared. It was natural. In a few hours, everything had changed for her. It wasn't easy to trust someone after everything she had been through. He didn't blame her for that. The narrow road gave way to a dirt path surrounded by trees. The weak light of dawn barely illuminated the small, simple house that soon appeared ahead. The truck slowed to a stop in the yard. The engine rumbled softly before being turned off, plunging the surroundings into a thick silence. Stephanie gripped the baby tighter, her eyes now fixed on the dark house. Jason noticed the tension in her face. "It's safe," he said, turning to face her. "This is my house." She bit her lip, unsure. "My wife, Laura, is inside," he continued, "and my daughter, Karen. They'll be happy to meet you." Still hesitant, Stephanie simply nodded. Jason opened the truck door and stepped down, walking around to help her. When he extended his hand to her, the girl hesitated, but after a moment, she took the trucker's calloused hand, letting him help her down carefully. As soon as they stepped onto the ground, the door of the house creaked open. A figure appeared on the porch, rubbing their sleepy eyes. It was Laura, Jason's wife. She blinked a few times, trying to shake off the sleep and understand what she was seeing. Her gaze first landed on her husband, then on the frail girl beside him, and finally on the baby wrapped in cloth too thin to protect him from the cold of the early morning. Her expression instantly changed, surprise giving way to concern. "Jason?" Her voice carried a note of worry. "What's going on? Who are these children?" Jason let out a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. He knew the situation seemed absurd, and explaining everything in a few seconds wouldn't be easy. "I found them on the road," he said, keeping his voice low. "She was holding the baby, alone in the cold, asking for help. She said she had no one. I couldn't leave them there." Laura's eyes widened, shock evident on her face. She looked at Stephanie, who flinched slightly, and then back at Patrick, whose breathing was so weak that for a moment she feared he might be ill. "My God," she murmured, bringing one hand to her mouth. "Alone? In the middle of the night?" Jason nodded. "She said her parents disappeared. They have nowhere to go." Laura stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. Her eyes went back to the baby, and something inside her seemed to stir. Her expression softened, and her maternal instinct took over. "Can I hold him?" she asked, her voice now softer. Stephanie clutched Patrick closer, hesitating. Her eyes met Jason's for a moment, as if seeking permission. "It's okay," he said with a small nod. With a careful gesture, Stephanie handed the baby over, allowing Laura to take him in her arms. As soon as she felt him nestled against her chest, Laura's expression completely changed. Her fingers slid over the baby's little face, and she pulled him close, instinctively rocking him gently. "He's so weak," she murmured, almost to herself. Then she raised her eyes to Jason. "We need to get them some warmth and food." Jason nodded and looked at Stephanie. "Shall we?" The girl hesitated for a moment, but seeing Patrick safe in the woman's arms, she nodded slowly. When they reached the porch, a soft sound broke the silence. A small figure was standing in the doorway, watching everything with curiosity. Karen, Jason's daughter, almost the same age as Stephanie, was watching the newcomer with wide, attentive eyes. The dim light from the house behind her made her delicate silhouette stand out even more. Karen took a step forward, first eyeing Stephanie cautiously, as if trying to understand who this unknown girl was. Then she smiled gently. Without saying a word, she extended her hand. Stephanie looked at her, surprised. Her eyes seemed uncertain, as if she didn't know how to respond. Seconds passed in a silence filled with expectation. And then, slowly, she extended her own hand and accepted the gesture. That handshake sealed something larger than just a simple greeting. It was a beginning. The night continued in silence, but filled with meaning. After they entered the house, Laura took Patrick to the living room, where she turned on a soft light and, with great care, began to examine him more closely. The baby was dirty, his little face pale, his cheeks cold to the touch of her fingers. Laura's heart ached. "He needs a warm bath and food," she said, looking at Jason, who nodded. Stephanie, still near the door, watched everything with a wary and attentive gaze. "Stephanie," Laura called gently, "come with me, dear. Let's take care of your brother first." The girl didn't respond immediately, but followed Laura, staying close to Patrick, as if afraid he might disappear if she lost sight of him. Laura warmed up some water and, with care, began to clean the baby. Her movements were gentle and patient. Stephanie stayed beside her, watching every gesture closely. "You can help me?" Laura asked, handing the girl a small clean cloth. Stephanie hesitated, but took the cloth and began to mimic the woman's actions, wiping the baby's arms and chest carefully. Jason stood in the doorway, watching the scene. Laura had always had a natural gift for taking care of others, and he knew that, at that moment, both Patrick and Stephanie needed her. After the baby was cleaned and dressed in soft clothes that belonged to Karen when she was younger, Laura turned to Stephanie. "Now it's your turn." The girl tensed. "I'm fine," she murmured, hugging her arms around herself. Laura moved closer and smiled. "I know you are, but you'll feel much better after a warm bath and clean clothes. Come on, I promise it won't take long." Stephanie looked at Jason as if seeking confirmation. "It's okay," he said with a light smile. Still hesitant but not refusing, the girl followed Laura. Meanwhile, Jason went to the kitchen. He knew that Stephanie and Patrick needed a real meal. The cookies they had eaten during the trip weren't enough to satisfy the hunger of someone who probably hadn't eaten properly in days. Laura returned a few minutes later with Stephanie wearing a simple pajama, her hair still damp. She looked smaller without the dirty, worn clothes, and her eyes showed an exhaustion she was only now allowing herself to feel. "Come, dear," Laura called, pulling out a chair for her. Stephanie sat slowly, looking at the plate in front of her. A hot soup, pieces of bread, and a glass of warm milk. "Eat," Jason said, sitting next to her. The girl picked up the spoon slowly, but as soon as she took the first bite, she seemed to lose all hesitation. She ate quickly, like someone who didn't know when they would have another meal. Laura and Jason exchanged a silent look, both feeling a tightness in their chest. "Slow down, Stephanie," Laura said gently. "There's more if you want." The girl looked at her, and for a moment her eyes seemed to shine with something that could have been gratitude. After the meal, Laura settled Patrick in the makeshift crib with soft blankets. The baby sighed and, for the first time that night, slept peacefully. Stephanie stood by the crib, her fingers gripping the fabric of her shirt. "You can sleep on the couch," Laura said, adjusting a pillow. "Or, if you prefer, you can share a room with Karen." The girl looked toward the other child, who was watching her with curiosity, then at Jason, as if seeking an answer. "You decide, Stephanie," he said. She hesitated, then looked at Patrick. "Can I stay here with him?" she asked softly. Laura smiled and nodded. "Of course you can." Jason turned off a few lights, and when he looked at Stephanie again, saw that the girl was already lying next to the makeshift crib, her eyelids heavy, but still fighting sleep. "Good night, Stephanie," he said. The girl didn't answer immediately, but before closing her eyes, she whispered almost imperceptibly, "Good night." That was the first night in a long time that Stephanie slept without fear. The next morning, Jason woke up early, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Before anything else, they needed to eat. When he entered the kitchen, he found Laura already preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and warm milk filled the room, bringing a sense of comfort that Stephanie and Patrick hadn't known for a long time. The girl was sitting at the table, silent but more awake than the night before. Her eyes watched Laura's every move, as if she still couldn't believe that this place was safe. Patrick, nestled in the woman's arms, seemed more at ease, his sleepy eyes blinking slowly. "Come on, sit down, Jason," Laura said, serving him coffee. He complied, grabbing a piece of bread and looking at Stephanie. "We need to go to town today," he said calmly. "Look for the authorities. See if any family is looking for you." Stephanie stopped chewing, lowering her head slightly. She didn't say anything, but Jason noticed her fingers gripping the glass she was holding. Laura, sensing the girl's tension, placed a gentle hand on her arm. "It will be okay, dear," she said. "No one will do anything without talking to us first." Stephanie nodded slowly, but her expression was still one of distrust. After breakfast, Laura bundled Patrick in a thicker blanket. Stephanie stayed by his side the whole time, making sure the baby was okay. When they were finally ready, they left for the town. The drive was silent, but Stephanie didn't seem as scared as before. She kept Patrick close to her, but looked out the window, watching the streets and the people passing by. When they reached the social services building, Jason entered first, explaining to the receptionist the reason for his visit. In a few minutes, they were led to a room where a social worker greeted them. The questions came quickly. They wanted to know how he had found the children, in what condition they were, how long they had been alone. Jason answered everything calmly, without omitting any details. When Stephanie was called to give a statement, she looked at him, hesitant. Her small fingers gripped Jason's hand tightly, her eyes filled with the fear of someone who had never been able to trust adults. "It's okay," he whispered. She took a deep breath before letting go of Jason's hand and, with hesitant steps, followed the social workers into another room. Her gaze still carried distrust, as if she expected something bad to happen at any moment. Jason watched every movement attentively, resisting the urge to follow her. He knew this moment was necessary, but seeing how Stephanie held her body tense and her eyes downcast, as if she was waiting for a trap, made his chest tighten. While waiting, the social worker responsible for the case began to review the available records, typing on the computer with increasingly worried expressions. After a few minutes, he sighed and removed his glasses, looking at Jason with a serious expression. "There are no recent records of the children's family," he said, crossing his arms. "No close relatives have contacted the authorities looking for them." Jason closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting out a long sigh. He had expected that answer, but hearing the confirmation made it even more real. "What happens to them now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The social worker straightened up in his chair before responding. "Given the circumstances, the standard procedure would be to send them to a shelter. There, they would be under the state's care until a more thorough investigation could locate a relative." Jason felt a knot form in his throat. The idea of Stephanie and Patrick, after everything they had been through, going to a shelter, far from any familiar face, troubled him deeply. He remembered how Stephanie held Patrick, the fear in her eyes, the way she had clung to his hand when they entered that building. He straightened his shoulders. "My wife and I want to take care of them." The social worker raised his eyebrows, surprised. "You want to take guardianship?" "Yes," Jason said firmly. "If there's no one else for them, we'll be there." The man was silent for a moment, studying the seriousness in the trucker's eyes. Then he took a pen and began filling out some paperwork. "You'll need to go through a formal process," he explained. "Interviews, home visits, background checks. It won't be quick or easy, but if you really want to be temporary guardians, we can start the paperwork." Jason nodded without hesitation. "Can you start now?" he asked. The social worker gave a slight smile, shaking his head. "You don't waste any time, do you?" "Not when it comes to them." And so the first steps were taken. The bureaucratic path would be long, but Jason didn't care. Stephanie and Patrick had nowhere else to go. Now they had a home. Days passed, turning into weeks quickly. What once seemed like a temporary situation slowly became part of everyone's routine in that house. Stephanie and Patrick's presence was no longer something strange, but natural, as if they had always been there. Laura dedicated herself to the baby with a care that went beyond simple obligation. Patrick, once so frail and silent, started to respond to the stimuli around him. At first, he just opened his eyes longer, observing everything with attention. Then, he began to react to touch, seeking the warmth of the embrace that now never left him. Until one day, when Laura softly called his name, he smiled for the first time. "Jason, come see this," Laura called, her voice filled with emotion. The trucker rushed from the porch and saw the scene. Patrick in Laura's arms, smiling widely at her. "Look at this, man," she said, emotional. "He's smiling." Jason smiled back, feeling something warm in his chest. It's because he knows now that he's safe. If Patrick adapted quickly, Stephanie took more time. Although she wasn't as scared as in the first days, she still slept little. At night, Jason would often wake up and find her, with her eyes wide open on the mattress beside Patrick's crib, as if she feared everything would disappear at any moment. But each morning, When she woke up and found Karen waiting for her to play, each meal served without having to beg, each look of affection from Laura and Jason started to convince her that life could indeed be different. "Do you always wake up so early?" Karen asked one morning, seeing her sitting on the bed even before the sun had risen. Stephanie shrugged. "It's a habit." Karen looked at her for a moment, then sat next to her. "If you want, I can wake you up a little later tomorrow," she said, as if it were a secret. "That way you sleep more." Stephanie stared at her, surprised. Few people had ever cared about her sleep before. She hesitated for a moment before murmuring, "Maybe." It was an advance. But then, one day, everything changed. The phone rang in the afternoon, while Jason was cleaning some tools in the yard and Laura was folding clothes inside. "Can you answer?" she asked him. Jason wiped his hands on a cloth and picked up the phone. "Hello?" On the other end of the line, the voice of the social worker sounded serious. "Mr. Jason, we have news about Stephanie and Patrick's case." His chest tightened. He knew this moment would come, but even so, he felt a different weight when he heard those words. "We found a record," the worker continued. "They're not the parents, but the children's maternal grandparents are alive, and they've been looking for them for months." Jason stood silent for a moment. Part of him felt relief. Stephanie and Patrick had family, but another part was gripped by an unexpected fear. What did this mean for them? "We'll schedule a visit," said the worker. "The grandparents want to see them as soon as possible." Jason took a deep breath. Understood. After hanging up the phone, he stayed still for a while, feeling the weight of the news. How would he tell Stephanie? When he entered the house, he found the girl sitting in the living room, playing with Karen, while Patrick slept in the stroller beside her. "Stephanie," he called, sitting on the couch. She looked up, noticing the serious tone in his voice. "I got a call just now," he said. "Your grandparents are alive." Her eyes widened slightly. "My grandparents?" "Yes, they've been looking for you." Stephanie didn't respond. She stayed still, staring at the ground, her fingers clutching the hem of her shirt. Jason noticed that her silence wasn't of relief, but of doubt. "Do you remember them?" Laura asked, sitting next to her. Stephanie shook her head slowly. "Not much," she admitted. "Maybe some voices, but not their faces." Karen watched her in silence, unsure of what to say. "They want to see you," Jason said. Stephanie finally looked up at him. "And if they want to take us away?" The fear in her voice was palpable. Laura held her hand. "You don't have to decide anything right now. We'll meet your grandparents and understand what they want. Everything will be resolved calmly." Stephanie nodded, but her gaze was still filled with uncertainty. The visit was scheduled for the next day. From the moment they knew the grandparents were alive, a different kind of silence hung in the house. Stephanie was restless, and even without speaking much about it, it was clear that her heart was divided. On the morning of the meeting, Laura noticed the girl barely touched her food. She was sitting at the table, fiddling with the bread without really eating. "Are you nervous?" Laura asked, sitting next to her. Stephanie shrugged, not lifting her gaze. "What if they're bad?" she asked in a whisper. "What if they take me away? What if they separate me from Patrick?" Jason, who was nearby, came closer and crouched beside her. "Your grandparents came here because they want to see you," he said, using the calm voice he always used when he wanted Stephanie to feel safe. "But no one will make any decision without you. You can say what you want, and we'll listen." The girl bit her lip, still uneasy, but nodded slowly. "I just want Patrick to stay with me," she murmured. Laura squeezed her hand. "That won't change." Time passed quickly. When the grandparents' car parked in front of the house, tension filled the air. Jason and Laura stood on the porch, while Stephanie stayed by the door, holding Patrick in her arms. Karen was next to her as if she sensed her friend needed support. The elderly woman was the first to get out of the car. Her grey hair was tied back simply, and her hands trembled as she held her purse to her chest. The man beside her, with a serious expression, kept his gaze firm, but his bright eyes revealed the emotion he was holding back. When the woman's eyes met Stephanie's, she brought one hand to her mouth, swallowing a sob. "My God," she murmured, taking a hesitant step forward. "You're so big." Stephanie stood still, holding Patrick even tighter. Her gaze was fixed on the two strangers in front of her, trying to find something familiar in them. The man, who had said nothing until then, took a deep breath and looked at Jason before speaking. "We are Stephanie and Patrick's grandparents," he said, his voice deep but faltering. "We've been looking for them for so long." Laura noticed Stephanie's tension and decided to intervene. "Why don't we go inside?" she suggested with a welcoming smile. "We can talk more calmly." The grandmother nodded quickly. Yes, of course." They went inside, where Laura served coffee and juice. The atmosphere was thick with emotion, but no one knew exactly how to start the conversation. It was the grandmother who broke the silence first. "Since the day when... What happened to your parents?" she started, her voice trembling. "We tried to find them. We searched. We asked. But we never got an answer. We didn't know where they were." She looked at Stephanie, her eyes welling with tears. "I lost hope so many times." The grandfather, who had kept his rigid posture until then, finally softened and looked at his granddaughter. "We didn't know if you were alive," he said in a heavy tone. "And now, seeing you like this after so long..." He closed his eyes for a moment, controlling his emotions, but when he opened them again, he looked directly at Stephanie. "I know we're nobody to you right now," he said, "but we're your family, and we only want the best for both of you." Stephanie squeezed the hem of her shirt, feeling her chest rise and fall quickly. Jason noticed and approached a little more so she knew he was still there. The girl took a deep breath and looked at her grandparents. "I don't remember you," she said, softly but firmly. "But I remember when Patrick and I were alone. I had to take care of him. I tried my best." The grandmother nodded her head, tears silently falling down her face. "I believe you, my love," she said with affection. Stephanie took a deep breath and looked at Jason and Laura before continuing. "Now, I have them," she said, looking at the two. "They helped me. They gave me a home. I don't want to leave." There was a heavy silence. The grandmother looked at her husband before responding. "We don't want to take you away from those who cared for you," she said sincerely. "We just want to be close." The adults exchanged looks, and slowly the solution began to take shape. The grandparents would stay in the same city, close enough to be part of the children's lives, but not take them from the home where, for the first time, they felt safe. The paperwork was completed. Guardianship was shared. The fate didn't have to be cruel again. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Jason sat on the porch and looked at the starry sky. Laura came out and sat next to him. "Are you thinking about everything that happened?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Jason let out a sigh and smiled faintly. "Yes. Who would have thought the road would bring me here?" Laura smiled. "Maybe that's exactly what it was meant for all along." He looked inside the house where, in the background, he could hear Karen and Stephanie laughing softly in the bedroom. The trucker, who once wandered aimlessly, now had a family bigger than he ever imagined. The road, which once symbolized loneliness, had taken him to the only place where he truly belonged. And in the distance, as the wind blew gently, the sound of children's laughter filled the air, bringing the certainty that some stories end exactly as they should, not with goodbyes, but with new beginnings. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.